In this presentation, we are going to present the idea of keeping fossil fuels underground in biodiverse hotspots of developing countries. We will begin with a summary about the main arguments we are going to follow in this presentation. The first point we are going to discuss and demonstrate is that current demand-side mitigation policies so far have proven insufficient to avoid catastrophic effects of climate change. So new tools are necessary to save the planet. Secondly, according with recent scientific evidence, at least 2/3 of fossil fuel reserves must be kept unexploited to fulfill the goals of Paris Agreement. However, there is not yet any accepted or shared criteria to define which reserves might be unburnable. So a tool for expanding mitigation tools, giving reserves, certain reserves unexploited is badly needed. Our argument is that fossil fuel reserves located beneath biodiverse hotspots, particularly in developing countries, can be defined as unburnable because their extraction costs has the highest environmental damage, the highest environmental impact, particularly in terms of biodiversity loss. The Yasuni Initiative, which was presented by Ecuador in 2007 and canceled later on in 2013, was an interesting model accepted and promoted by the United Nations to keep fossil fuels unexploited in a very important biodiverse reserve in Ecuador. This agreement can be a kind of model for defining a compensation framework that will allow developing countries to keep fossil fuels underground. This is essentially the structure of the arguments we are going to explain in the following minutes. Well, the first point is that mitigation policies are not being effective enough to avoid catastrophic effects of climate change. Here we have the latest data available about greenhouse emissions, particularly CO2 concentration in the atmosphere in the last decades. In the 1970s, carbon dioxide concentration surpassed the safe limit of 350 parts per million, but they are continually increasing without any sign of effective mitigation policies. So these concentrations, which are the main factor in human-induced climate change, are still completely out of control. Here we have the most recent data about both carbon dioxide emissions worldwide and greenhouse gas emissions, including other gases, from 1970 to the latest available information around 2020. the total emissions actually might have been reaching a kind of plateau, might have peaking. However, up to now, there is not any kind of sign of a declining trend, which is absolutely needed in order to fulfill the Paris Agreement goals. Here we have information with the latest report from IPCC, in which we can clearly appreciate the gap between the real commitments and projections, which are depicted in the chart in orange, which follow a kind of stable trend on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have the needed decline, particularly the one which is depicted in light blue, which clearly shows a very, very big gap between current mitigation policy results and which is needed to avoid devastating effects of climate change at the end of the century. So, as a conclusion, we can see that current mitigation policy are not effective enough so far to avoid the disaster at the end of the century. New policy tools are needed. Basically, both Kyoto and Paris mitigation tools have been historically based on demand control. The basic idea is to put a price of carbon so that by increasing the price of carbon, demand can begin to decline. The idea is to control demand to avoid the emissions or keep emissions controlled or declining. We have two basic mechanisms: carbon trading, which has been applied mostly in Europe and recently adapted by China in the last year, and also carbon taxes. However, this mechanism, the two of these mechanisms are still very weak. We can see that according with the latest World Bank report, only 21% of world carbon dioxide emissions are controlled by any kind of carbon pricing. And in addition to that, carbon prices are rather low and quite unstable. Here we have the evolution of carbon prices. In Europe, since the beginning of carbon markets around 2008 to present, we can see that particularly after the 2008 depression, carbon prices actually collapsed and they kept in very low levels up to for about 10 years. And they are beginning to rise again, but only from 2018 onwards. Now carbon prices are very high, but given this instability and the long periods of very low prices, the mechanisms have been far from efficient. So we need to complement demand-side mitigation tools that have been the most important ones in the past by trying to reduce or to declare unburnable for certain fossil fuel reserves. We need a supply-side mitigation. That means essentially that a group of reserves cannot be allowed to be exploited. That is a very important goal because there is nothing done in this kind of policy. The first evidence, the first scientific, very strong scientific evidence about the need to regulate fossil fuel reserves and declare some of them are vulnerable was the Menhausen article published by Nature in 2009, in which the authors demonstrated that if all fossil fuel reserves will be burned, then global warming will be around 5 centigrade degrees at the end of the century, which is a catastrophic outcome. The only way to avoid it is to keep unexploited at least half of the reserves. That was the thesis that Menhausen, another author, presented in 2009. Later on, we have other more recent research. Here we have the results of a last article published in 2021, in which we have broken down the reserves that must remain unexploited, both by fossil fuels and by region. In the case of Central and South America, 73%, about 3/4 of oil reserve must remain unexploited in 2050, and about 2/3 will remain unexploited at the end of the century. Globally, 58% of oil reserves, 59% of gas reserves, and 89% of coal reserves must remain unexploited at 2050 to fulfill the Paris Agreement goals and avoid adverse effects of climate change. Our particular interest is linked with the link between biodiversity and extractive activities. We developed this map in which we present both the regional distribution of gas, oil, and coal reserves worldwide, and the distribution of biodiversity, taking into account mostly a group of biodiverse hotspots. We follow a national biodiverse index. We can see clearly that there is a strong overlap between biodiversity and fossil fuel reserves, particularly in the case of oil reserves in the Andean Amazon, and other cases. In the case of the Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so on. We made a specific analysis taking into account only developing biodiverse countries. This group, which covered around 17 countries in the world, concentrates 22% of reserves of oil reserves, 8% of gas reserves, and 31% of coal reserves. In total, the average is 24%. That means about 1/4 of all fossil fuel reserves are located on biodiverse developing countries. That is why the policy aimed to keep fossil fuels unexploited in this part of the world is quite important. Keeping fossil fuels underground in these biodiverse countries will allow to fulfill two quite strategic goals. First, be an effective tool to avoid climate change, and secondly, preserve biodiversity. We don't have now effective policy to solve the biodiversity loss problem. So this new tool will be very effective in two ways. Here we have a map about the most biodiverse hotspots in South America, particularly in the Amazon Basin. It was published in 2010, and it is important to demonstrate that the Yasuni National Park, which is located in the border between Ecuador and Peru in the Andean Amazon, is actually, it has been regarded as one of the most biodiverse hotspots in the planet. It is presented here in red color, which represent the most biodiverse areas in South America. So in the case of the Yasuni National Park, we have a clear overlap between a very important conservation value from the biodiversity perspective and a huge oil reserve located below the surface. That is why in 2007, Ecuador presented the idea to the United Nations of keeping fossil fuels indefinitely underground in the Yasuni reserve. The idea was essentially that Ecuador will commit itself to keep indefinitely unexploited about almost 1 billion barrels of oil in the ITT reserve located inside the park. But the international community will compensate the country for the revenue loss of doing that. But the fund will be administered by the United Nations only with 4 specific goals. First, developing renewable energy projects. Secondly, protecting biodiversity. Third, promote equitable social development. And 4, improving energy efficiency all over the country. That means that the funds will be used for a transition towards a low carbon emission model, an inclusive development model. The initiative was canceled by President Correa in 2013. Nevertheless, the model is presented a quite innovative position that can be replicated in the future. Finally, we can present the main idea of this proposal, which is the creation of an international compensation fund, which will allow to keep unexploited fossil fuel reserves in developing countries. This fund can follow the structure defined in the ITT Yasuni Initiative, and the fund will be financed mostly by higher income countries and will transfer resources and opportunities to developing nations that can apply for it. The funds will be earmarked only for renewable energy projects, energy efficiency, biodiversity conservation, avoided deforestation, and activities proven to support the transition to a more equitable and sustainable economy involving diversification away from fossil fuels. That is a very important idea because oil exporting countries have very, very serious constraints to avoid a crisis and make a feasible transitions to a low emissions economy in the future. This idea is completely compatible with the Paris Agreement goals, and particularly Article 6 of Paris Agreement promotes the idea of creating groups, voluntary groups of countries which are willing to going beyond national commitments and propose of develop important tools or innovative tools to improve the efficiency of mitigation policies. Thank you very much.